Next up, we're going to hear from the Friends of the Highline Sustainability Project. Coming up, folks. While you do, I want to correct an earlier error. I forgot to say Colette before saying Eustace. Colette Eustace, Stewart's TA. Okay, great. Come on up.
All right, hello, my name is Mitchell Broadwater, and I was the group leader for our presentation on the working with the Friends of the Highline.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Pernetta. I worked on the research for, as you'll see, peer institutions and some of the corporate sustainability.
My name is Vincent, and I also worked on research and peer institutions.
Also on our team, but unfortunately not here today, were Tyrell White, Dylan Sachs, Miles Lewis, and Hagen Patterson. Now, we worked with the Friends of the Highline. If you guys are true New Yorkers, you've heard of the Highline by now. It's a 1.45-mile long elevated park that exists in downtown, and if you have some time today, I recommend you get out there. They're a relatively new institution, so they approached us because sustainability is a sort of key factor to their mission statement. And they were looking for new ways that they could develop and improve on sustainability, ways that they could sort of find those metrics for success. Now, we presented to them on Monday, and in our presentation we covered definitions of sustainability, talked about several peer institutions as far as different parks and urban green spaces that they could look to and then sort of modify their programs off of, and talked about corporate partnerships and the ethics of sustainability, ways that they could make sustainable partnerships to, again, elevate their work. Our final deliverables ended up being this presentation, a short video that you'll probably be able to find on the Highline's Instagram, and a final report which encapsulated all of this information and more. We also produced a list of sort of Highline factoids, which you'll see as either tweets or an underscore to their website.
So now I will present on the methodology in which we approached the question. So when the Highline came to us, we weren't actually too clear on what they were expecting. All they told us is that they wanted us to research aspects of sustainability as well as how the Highline could become more sustainable, and would also like us to focus on peer institutions because they want to learn what other similar organizations are doing. So what they wanted us to do initially was to identify peer organizations and to look at what they were doing that aligns with sustainability. So the way that we approached this initial question was first through literature review. So we looked at academic and scholarly articles on the definitions of urban sustainability and urban green spaces. And through our literature review, we identified a few key aspects that urban green spaces embody. And you can see that in this Venn diagram. So first of all, the environmental aspect, which is really important. Urban green spaces need to provide a space that is that has a lot of green and produces oxygen for the urban areas and provide a sanctuary for wildlife. Next is the education and cultural aspect. There is often an aspect of people coming together and learning about sustainability and sustainable ways of living, such as composting and urban gardening, for example. And the cultural aspect is that sometimes urban green spaces play a role in fostering community oneness and community gathering, so that they sort of create a space for themselves to develop an identity. Equity, which is really important. This space needs to be accessible to people of all income groups, so it can't lead. So one of the biggest problems, for example, would be gentrification as urban green spaces develop, and this was really relevant to the Highline, as a lot of you know, based on its development. Health, which is that urban green spaces tend to promote healthy ways of living in terms of encouraging people to go outdoors and creating a space that people like to spend time in, and that promotes their a healthy lifestyle in the city. And last but not least is the economic aspect. All this development of green space needs to be economically sustainable in some way so that it can perpetuate. And based on these criteria, we found quite a few peer projects. Of course, this list isn't comprehensive because there are much more examples around the world and in New York City itself. But these are just a few that we found that were representative of these categories. And as as you can see, there is no single project that sort of just fits squarely in one category. They all encompass these different categories, and therefore you can see that, and this is something that important that we learned about sustainability, in that there is no one single category that it fulfills and that it is all-encompassing. So some of the takeaways that we had with our peer institution analysis is, so three main aspects: social, economic, and environmental. First of all, a lot of the peer institutions that we research provide an interpersonal space. So many of the peer institutions, the Highline included, were built on spaces that were initially for industrial purposes. For example, former highways, as well as former factories, for example. And these spaces aren't necessarily places where people would want to go or spend time in, especially given the noise, given the pollution, and given the bad aesthetics. However, these spaces transform these areas and open up community space so that people can come and gather and spend time. They also provide a platform for awareness and education. For example, some of the peer institutions that we research actually open up opportunities for people to come in and grow food and to teach urban dwellers sustainable ways of living, such as composting and et cetera. And so they provide a means of education for sustainable living. And they also promote healthy activities and lifestyles across social economic spectrums. So as I said, promoting a healthy lifestyle and not only improving physical health by providing activities for providing space for outdoor activities, but also mental health. The next aspect is the economic aspect. Green spaces tend to bring in area improvements in terms of raising property values in the area where they were built. They provide jobs and job training, so a lot of the organizations that build green spaces tend to have initiatives that train the community around them to engage in, for example, to engage in green jobs and to train them for the workplace, and also improve life quality and economic status for the community. And last but not least is the environmental aspect. These green spaces tend to take unused industrial structures and transform them so that they become beautiful structures where people want to spend time in, and as well as sort of green them. So they plant a lot of trees in the case of the Highline, for example. And so they preserve not only the energy of the site, but also the history. A lot of green spaces such as the Highline, the Madrid Rio, the Berlin Tempelhof Airport preserve the structure of the site that they're in. And so this contributes to a place where people can come and learn the history of the city, and that enhances the community identity and the city identity of the city where the green space is built. They provide biodiversity hubs in that wildlife often could find green spaces to be important areas in the city where they can actually have an ecosystem to survive. A clean environment in that there are trees to produce oxygen for the city, as well as ecosystem services. So people can actually plant things there, and they have produce that they can derive economic value from.
So as Mitch mentioned at the beginning and Vincent went over, it was a little difficult for us. One of our main challenges at the beginning was figuring out what exactly our client wanted. But eventually we came together on the idea that they were looking for a sustainability narrative. And that's where looking at these peer institutions was really valuable. They were looking for what are other groups and what are other institutions doing to sort of embody sustainability, like as a whole ethos, and not simply one sort of part of their organization. And as part of that, in looking at these peer organizations, we discovered that a lot of them partner with corporate partners. They find corporations that also have similar goals and finance the parks and these peer institutions. So particularly with the Highline, this is very important because as a private-public partnership, they get funding from both the city and from corporate sponsors. So Dylan, who is our corporate sustainability research team leader, looked at creating a sort of matrix and creating a set of criteria that these institutions can use to sort of vet corporate partners. And she created a spreadsheet with several input variables where you can look at using criteria from the Green Bonds Initiative and several other organizations looking at rating a corporate partner and seeing whether or not they actually are committed to sustainability or they're just sort of looking for greenwashing. This was something the Highline had mentioned in a few of our initial meetings, but really came out through our research with the peer institutions. So looking at them and how they sort of look to corporate partners. And so basically what she found was that by putting these inputs in here and making sort of corporate sustainability almost a credit rating system, we were able to vet and look at partners. And so the one example she looked at was Whole Foods, where she had 2 columns basically of inputs where it looks at certain large themes of how they engage with sustainability, and you input whether or not they do it or not and sort of what degree they're actually committed to sustainability, and that can sort of give the Highline an idea of, do we want to partner with this person? Are their goals in line with ours? Can they sort of contribute to our sustainability narrative, or are they simply just looking for a partner to put on their website as we're sustainable? So in addition to the peer initiative sort of, this is how you create a sustainability narrative, we provided them a secondary tool that is, this is how you create a sustainability narrative and work with other institutions to forward this goal.
Okay, so our ultimate conclusions. In our research on corporate partnerships, we realized that while there is potential for greenwashing, there's also great potential for good. We researched a lot into TD Bank, which is a current partner with the Highline, and their investment as a sort of sustainable entity in the city of New York has really helped them develop as an institution. So by providing this metric, we were able to sort of help them figure out which institutions would be the best for the Highline and agree with their vision of sustainability, so that they can create more good.
And through our peer institution analysis, we found out that there are a variety of ways that green spaces could achieve sustainability goals.
And so finally, we also discovered, or we also found through our research, there were community and NGO peers. So these new sort of NGOs that are working with community green spaces to bring them into the fold, and not simply a park, but also a part for community interaction. That's all.
Okay, I don't think we have a question slide, but that's our presentation. Thank you very much. We would be happy to take questions, though.
Thank you for your presentation. Whether according to the kind of the credit matrix you developed or just kind of from qualitative or anecdotal data, what corporate group would you recommend that the Highline works with?
So one of the deliverables as far as the corporate sustainability credit rating model, and I wish we could bring it up to you, but it's an Excel doc, so a little bulky. Dylan recommended that they actually partner with Whole Foods. Whole Foods scored an A on our credit rating model, though if you changed even 1 degree, they fell back down to a B, so a bit of a borderline grade there. But they really did, they were a New York-based firm, very interested in supporting sustainable organizations and had a history of doing that, and basically checked a lot of the sort of boxes that the Highline was looking for. So they were one of our recommendations as a deliverable, sort of like if you're looking for a peer partnership, something that we saw in the Prinzessengarten, with the Princess Garden in Germany, was that a sort of food-based private organization partnering with a public park to provide, sort of refreshments and education for the people patronizing it.
Hello, is this on? Okay. In your matrix, when you talk about equity, I was just wondering if you also happen to look at what's it called, disability, and making sure that it's accessible for people with disabilities, given that that's part of equity. I think, I don't know if you happen to look at that, because I've been to the Highline, it's very stair heavy, and I was just wondering if that had been part of your analysis.
Gotcha. Well, there is at least one elevator at the Highline, and they do have some handy-capable entrances. But I'll confess, the equity portion of our research was mostly focused on housing being socioeconomically available across different classes. The 11th Street Bridge in D.C., you may hear more about, is connecting 2 very economically disparate neighborhoods, and a lot of their investment is going into making sure that people don't lose their housing as you get that sort of neighborhood improvement. We've seen initiatives like that clearly at the High Line, but also in institutions like the Atlanta Beltline.
Yes, so the equity portion of our analysis is actually one of the more interesting parts of our research because a lot of the projects that we looked at, for example, the ones that are not in italics, so like the Atlanta Beltline, the Madrid Rio, the Prinzessin and Garten, these are projects that came about quite much later, like started after the 2000s to 2010s. And so this was a time when equity became a very important issue in considering to consider when building these parks. So a lot of these parks actually incorporate equity quite actively into their planning. For example, the Atlanta Beltline publishes a lot of the minutes of their town hall meetings to the community, so ensuring that there's a lot of transparency. The Prinzessin and Garten uses a land trust model, which is more beneficial for like equity and access to the community than the High Line, for example. So a lot of these projects, which came about much later, actually focus on equity very early on, which is quite different from the High Line, which when it first started, its only goal was to preserve the High Line from being torn down. And they had gentrification as something that come up, but they didn't focus on it that much and didn't expect that gentrification would be such a big problem after their development. And so they also, so in our research, we also sort of went beyond the whole urban green spaces realm and looked at other more NGO, community-based NGOs like Sustainable South Bronx and the Pratt Center for Community Development, among others, to look at how organizations are actively going out to service their community and to try to mitigate the effects of rising housing prices. And so this was sort of the challenge that we gave to the High Line in that because gentrification and rising housing prices was something that already happened in their development, and so they sort of need to, in order to achieve that equity aspect, they need to find other ways to sort of mitigate that. So do they need to be a different sort of organization that also has that community NGO part in them, that is more advocacy sort of based?
Take one more.
Yes, on the equity matter, I just wondered, when you were developing your scores, did you use any existing matrices like this, like Ethisphere and Ethical Systems? And also Forbes has a top 100. It wouldn't pertain to the small organizations, but it would definitely pertain to things like Whole Foods. So I just wondered, did you start from scratch or did you?
So when Dylan made the model, she based it a lot on like corporate sustainability metrics like green bonds. But there are actually two parts to the model. So if we actually pull up the Excel sheet, there are two big categories for ratings. One is environmental, and the other is equity. So equity is something that Dylan took into account based on our research in her corporate sustainability model.
Thank you so much.